Thank you all for coming. My thanks to Mrs. Galloway's, this beautiful bookshop. Special thanks to Marion Abbott. I want to thank Andrea Young, co-publisher of The End of My Wits.
It's a little soft.
Okay. Andrea is also publisher of several of my earlier books of the epigrammatic. A year or two ago, Andrea also made a video about my writing in this form. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Interrogations of Thomas Farber.
It's very good.
Here's Andrea now. I hear her, even as we speak. Andrea, besides being modest, is an enormously talented artist in several media. It's been my great good fortune to work with her on a number of projects. My thanks also to the previous publishers of earlier work in this form. Donald S. Ellis, the late Peter Howard of Serendipity Books, that great bookstore, and writer-publishers Charles and Gail Entricken of Hip Pocket Press. Without the interest of these publishers, I'm unlikely to have so persistently pursued my curiosity. It really greatly helps to have someone offering you a destination and to be able to see a finished product. I once wrote, a writer is someone who needs to finish things. My thanks this evening also to fiction writer and poet Laura Glenn Lewis, whose ebullient afterward responding to my work closes this book. You might say Laura got a contact eye from immersing herself in my epigrams, and she rose to the occasion with wit and verve. So, some history. I was 49 in 1993, heading for age 50, which makes me now, if you can do the math, tumbling towards 70. Back then, I just had a seventh book published, and since then, from 93 till now, all kinds of other books about ocean, a novel, a memoir, books with marine photographer Wayne Levin, a screenplay with my great friend, the math genius Edward Frankel. But back in 1993, catapulted toward 50, a part of me was tired of narrative, of story. The novella that finished my 1993 book of stories about the death of a writer's mother seemed to have left me with no more story to tell. Or what was the point of story? There's a moment in that novella when the dying mother says to her son, "My poems aren't helping me here." My own mother, the poet Norma Farber, said this to me when she was dying, "My poems aren't helping me here." So, 20 years ago, as a writer approaching age 50, the death of a second parent that I had just written about, I was unsure of the value of narrative. I was in a wintry mood, tired maybe also of my own foibles, not to mention the foibles of other people. And this was despite the fact that I was in Hawaii much of the time, and soon, as it turns out, to write about warm ocean. But there was another kind of truths, almost another kind of language that I needed to try to articulate, if only for myself. So I started sitting down and then refining, draft after draft, notes, fragments, very short observations, 1- and 2-liners. I didn't know what I was up to. What form was I working in? Was it a journal, a notebook? What were the boundaries, if any? A writer is, you might say, someone willing to try to find out what he's up to, from which may come nothing at all, of course. One of my epigrammatics goes, "Aesthetes without an art have a high opinion of opinion. Aesthetes without an art have a high opinion of opinion." Which is to say, critics often underestimate the degree of difficulty of what an artist set out to do, heading out into the unknown, as opposed to the critic responding to a given text. Critics sometimes imagine their tasks are as difficult as the writers. So, the short and fragments. Before 1993, as early as 1977, in my collection, Who Wrote the Book of Love, some of my short stories were only a few pages long. Also, in my novel Curves of Pursuit, 1984, there were chapters only a page long. And in my meditation on the writing life, published in 1988, there were chapters only a line or two long. Like poets, that is to say, I seem to have no fear of white space. And perhaps like poets, I was arguing that the quality of what I was writing entitled me to the white space. Of course, there are risks in this kind of assumption. One of my epigrammatics goes, that poem, weak prose that couldn't go the distance. But still, back in 1993, what were these notes and fragments going to be, if anything? My friend, the Buddhist author, Stephen Mitchell, suggested that I set these short entries, one or two to a page, to see their quality. So it was that I wrote and rewrote in this mode, leaving lots of white space. I still have that first working manuscript from 1993. I titled it Breviary. That is, an abridgment, a compendium, but breviaries are also a book of daily prayer. I suppose I was invoking some power beyond myself, the power a commitment to art or anything sometimes bestows. But art's funny. It's a funny game. One of my fragments goes like this. Not, of course, that he'd set out to become an unpublished writer. Not, of course, that he'd set out to become an unpublished writer. In this kind of fragment, surrounded by white space, I was really promising to myself and others that there'd be reverberations. So, 1993, I'm surfing in Hawaii, sailing in the South Pacific, gearing up for 2 water books, and the 3 books I was going to collaborate on with the great marine photographer Wayne Levin. But between these long stays in the South Pacific, I turned to authors of short, terse forms. La Rochefoucauld, Joubert, Marshall, Jabez, Oscar Wilde, Lichtenberg, Nietzsche, Jabez, Ambrose Bierce, Dorothy Parker, many others. I was deep diving in the ocean of aphorisms, axioms, maxims, proverbs, adages, apothegms, Zen koans, epigrams. All of them are about compression and generalization. Proverbs, apothegms, and adages seldom have known authors. They seem time-worn to us, even stock. A stitch in time saves 9. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. As for the forms that do have known authors, well, what I was drawn to in them was verbal artistry in a compressed form. I was hearing a word or phrase as if for the first time, revealing or explicating latent or forgotten language, the life in that language. I was into verbal surprise, paradox, unexpected similarities, rejuvenating word inversions, capricious juxtapositions, willfully mixed metaphors, rueful acknowledgement. And the subject? Well, the subject often was moral blindness, mortality, self-serving, teasing out the component energies of vices, virtues, and fallibilities. In her afterword, Laura Glenn Lewis writes that I address among the array of human frailties, false modesty, secrecy, adultery, betrayal, aging, dying, death, the self-delusion, about the same. It's true, this kind of endeavor can be subversive. John Gross, in his introduction to the Oxford Book of Aphorisms, says, deflation is more common than consolation, unless, of course, you believe that wit and compression in themselves can console. For the writer, in any case, this kind of craft can lead to the pleasure of setting things straight, to a state of kind of bittersweet disenchantment. There's also a hunger for the oracular. For instance, here are 2 of mine. Some night the sun will die, death too. Some night the sun will die, death too. Or old age, when no one can save you. Old age, when no one can save you. So, for what I was doing, there were predecessors, but I didn't really like the terms that were available, adage, maxim, axiom, epigrams maybe, but I was more drawn to the adjective epigrammatic. So over time, I made the adjective into a noun, epigrammatics, something short, often a specific or particular aspiring to the universal, or a very short story aspiring to be a kind of prime number. I wrote this definition at Andrea Young's request. Epigram, a terse observation aspiring to the universal and irreducible, generally about human foible or fate, relies on paradox, hyperbole, or wordplay to compel a flash of recognition. Kissing cousin of axioms, parables, maxims, apothegms. So back in 1993, here's the one that began it all. Hi, Mikey. A man in middle age sitting in an outdoor cafe, two young women walking past his table faster than he thinks he'd be able to run after them. A man in middle age sitting in an outdoor cafe, two young women walking past his table faster than he thinks he'd be able to run after them. Here's another one from back then. Sex, what puts you in contact with people you might otherwise never know. Sex, what puts you in contact with people you might otherwise never know. You have to be careful what you ask the gods of art for. These last decades, the last 2 decades, as I wrote many other books, I've done 2 chapbooks and 4 books of the epigrammatic. This form became for me a kind of default setting when I wasn't doing other kinds of writing or when I wasn't writing at all. Each of my books of the epigrammatic also contains a companion essay, both as a kind of counterpoint to remind the reader at the end of the book what the epigrams aren't and what they can't be, but also functioning as a way for me to examine what I thought I was up to, what I thought I shouldn't have been up to. Like all art, the epigrammatic can lead one astray. Here's one of my epigrammatics. A writer, someone willing to hurt others. A writer, someone willing to hurt others. As for these essays, for me, maybe the whole point of the epigrams was to get to write the essays. I don't know. I hope if you read the book, you'll give the essays as much thought. Anyway, so here we are now, 20 years later, the End of My Wits, containing all of these earlier chapbooks and books, a new introduction, a final new infusion of the epigrammatic, and Laura Glenn Lewis's afterward. The full catastrophe, to quote Zorba the Greek. Here are a few more. Afternoon sex, something you get into with your eyes open. Afternoon sex, something you get into with your eyes open. At 50, uncomfortable sharing, low need for affiliation. Only child become only adult. At 50, uncomfortable sharing, low need for affiliation. Only child become only adult. Here's one. Lecher, from the French, to lick. A man immoderately given to sexual indulgence, as characterized by the immoderately envious. See, we hear the word lecher used as a pejorative. I want to kind of have us rethink that. Lecher, from the French, to lick. A man immoderately given to sexual indulgence, as characterized by the immoderately envious. So what about this form, this impulse to compression, to the irreducible, the untranslatable? Australian philosopher Damon Young writes that these are attempts to put an idea crisply and boldly, to seduce and elevate, as Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche put it, which sounds very high-minded. But the aphorist Aaron Haspel, a kind of dour writer of aphorisms, sees his own art as no more than a cure for a disability. Haspel writes, if you're unable to form a consecutive chain of thought of 2 sentences, then by all means take up the aphorism. Composer Richard Wagner said that collections of aphorisms always reminded him of performing fleas. For the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, an aphorism, he's French, an aphorism is like the starry sky, the blanks in it being the intersidereal void. Well, the Scottish poet and aphorist Don Patterson teases, A poem is a form of words that advertises its own significance. So with the aphorism, the difference being that all that exists of it is the advertisement. A writer named Morgan Meese argues, the epigram is the enemy of narrative. Narrative, Meese argues, is about threes. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Birth, life, death, and so on. But a good epigram, he says, dispenses with the middle altogether. Similarly, he says, proof, like narrative, is a creature of triples. Premise, argument, conclusion. The epigrammatic, however, goes right for conclusion. As for the form's predilection, at least in the West, for tough love, or even for something akin to malice, the poet Louise Gluck has Circe, the sorceress in the Odyssey. She says, I never turned anyone into a pig. Some people are pigs. I make them look like pigs. This kind of tone was established by the Roman poet Martial. He was a famous epigrammist, and he wrote this about another poet. You pluck your chest hairs, your legs, and your arms. Everyone knows you shave your pubic hair for your girlfriend. But then why do you pluck the hair around your anus? That was the Roman poet Martial many years ago. Well aware of this bitter tone in the form, the wonderful poet William Matthews, who died way too young, he said, it's important to find ways to be angry with human folly and failure and still be forgiving of it at the same time. Well, that's not so simple, is it? Matthews also wrote, the best epigrams, like the ending of great poems, shimmer and twist. Little is ended. There's much to think and feel. The rhetorical pleasure of the epigram may be its conclusiveness and concision, but the soul of its brevity is a long thoughtfulness. That's a great line. The soul of its brevity is a long thoughtfulness. Here's one I wrote. Breast. Proffer of a nipple. Child's play at any age. Try it again. These are easier when they're drowning in white space. Breast. Proffer of a nipple. Child's play at any age. How did I get to this? I'm a sick person. But I don't want to pull back the curtain on all the mystery of such an arcane art, but I can tell you it begins with the human body, two bodies, actually, and my marveling, more than ever the older I get, about what can pass between two bodies. Talk about the ordinary miraculous. I think you have to be a certain age to really savor some things, and for sure I'm of a certain age. So, in my thinking about this epigram, you have two people and a nipple at hand, so to speak, a nipple at lip. What's going on? Well, a nipple is being offered. But there's way more than that going on. There has to be a better word than offered. As it turns out, all it took was adding the letter P, which got me from the word offer to proffer. Proffer, this is not often heard in our daily American English, but it shows up in business, the good faith offer before formal negotiating. Also in courts of law about the offering of evidence, which leads us to the verbal karma of terms like burden of proof, inflammatory evidence, and hearsay, which is not to be confused with double hearsay, not to mention trials or even trials by ordeal. But back to proffer. This profusion of resonances and overtones was brought into play for and brought to bear on a nipple just by adding the P to offer. Fucking A. Or fucking P. Proffer of a nipple, child's play at any age. But that wasn't all I was up to. Not hardly. I imagined the proffer of a nipple to a nursing child. And then I began to imagine, to really imagine, such a proffer to those who are long since no longer children, who won't ever be kids again. The kind of person I am, for instance. Which got me to, what would such a former kid be thinking, or appreciating, or savoring? Breast, proffer of a nipple, child's play at any age, and so on. Well, that's about as much of the mystery of this kind of melody as I want to convey. Like all artists, I like to think this kind of thing is harder than it looks. Should you try it, what you're after is something irreducible in its brevity, and if you're lucky, something with the power to startle or amuse or awaken or to inform. Something as old Horace advised in his Ars Poetica, something that pleases and instructs. For those of you eager to write critical studies of this form, try this one. Compare and contrast thongs and the epigrammatic. You know what thongs are. Compare and contrast thongs and the epigrammatic. Work on that. And from time by the ocean, I spend a lot of time in the ocean. Here's this one. Beach, bikini bottoms, barely covering genitals, anus, perineum. G-strings, C-strings, V-strings. Hilo dental, Spanish for dental floss. Artifice inveigling you to imagine yourself next to nothing. Once more. Beach, bikini bottoms, barely covering genitals, anus, perineum. G-strings, C-strings, V-strings, hilo dental, Spanish for dental floss. Artifice inveigling you to imagine yourself next to nothing. That took a lot of work on the beach. Here's one. He was on top of her. She was underappreciated. He was on top of her. She was underappreciated. See, there are all of these idioms and phrases we have, and the life seems to go out of them. You know, something's underappreciated. I was trying to wake us up to the language. He was on top of her, she was underappreciated. Here's one in a slightly different mood. Second childhood, when you get to change your own diapers. Second childhood, when you get to change your own diapers. We all know that yoga is very fashionable now. I'm a keen observer of contemporary events. Here was my response. And you read about the deplorable fact that some yoga teachers were doing naughty things. Here's the epigram that came from that. Yoga teachers have sex with students, but still, not a word of mention of autofellatio. Think about that. Yoga teachers have sex with students, but still, no mention of autofellatio. The dead, we'll shift to gear, the dead. Invisible, but not inaudible. The dead, invisible, but not inaudible. Here's one. She hopes he doesn't fuck like he eats. She hopes he doesn't fuck like he eats. Think about that. Think about some people you see eating. And then see where it leads you someday. It could lead you to an epigram like this. Here's one. Restaurant table for two, husband and wife conversing without eye contact. Smartphones in hand. Smart indeed. Release from the marital pressure of undivided attention. I mean, it's kind of amazing what you see nowadays, right? People are with each other and they're talking, but they're not looking at each other. Here's one. The old have two questions. Do you think I always look like this? And two, do you think you'll never look like this? The old have two questions. Do you think I've always looked like this? Two, do you think you'll never look like this? Let me take a sip of water. You look like an oil painting out there. The first hour and a half of this is going to be the slowest. Yeah. The second hour, bear with me. Domestication, to breed in captivity. Dogs and ducks, silk moths and cows, llamas and goldfish, husbands and wives. Domestication, to breed in captivity. Dogs, ducks, silk moths, cows, llamas, goldfish, husbands, wives. When the painter Mark Rothko, the famous painter, when the painter Mark Rothko said, "Silence is so accurate," silence is what he broke. When painter Mark Rothko said, "Silence is so accurate," silence is what he broke. Here's one closer to our vernacular. He said, "Motherfucker," so often, you had to take him at his word. He said, "Motherfucker," so often, you had to take him at his word. Monogamy. So you can each focus on food. Monogamy. So you can each focus on food. I wrote this to salute Berkeley. Sometimes the game for the writer is to try to get something as short as you think it can be said. Here's one. Hypochondria, overkill. Hypochondria, overkill. You know what hyperbole is, so I made a word, a hyperbolist. Hyperbolist, choking, superlative stuck in the craw of his better self. Hyperbolist, choking, superlative stuck in the craw of his better self. Some life forms never have sex and die, they say, only from external hazards. Life forms that do have sex always die. Isn't that interesting? Some life forms never have sex, die, they say, only from external hazards. Life forms that do have sex always die. So sometimes I'm just learning something and it shakes me up. Here's one. Freud, no sexual intercourse after age 40. Gandhi, celibate from age 36 on. Draw the correct inference. Freud, no sexual intercourse after age 40. Gandhi, celibate from age 36 on. Draw the correct inference. The wonderful George Corrigan was laughing when he heard this because he said, "What is the correct inference?" Oh, I don't know. I haven't a clue. Here's one. With "fuck you," the I is silent and well understood. With "fuck you," the I is silent and well understood. Right? But sometimes we kind of forget it. We don't remember. There's an I in that. Old age, farewells in progress, some of them not articulated. Oneself in the mirror, person to whom you must be sure to say goodbye. Old age, farewells in progress, some not articulated. Oneself in the mirror, person to whom you must be sure to say goodbye. Here's one. Buddhism is a very big thing in Northern California. And so I'm in the company of many Buddhists, and I pay attention. Since nothing happens without a higher purpose, what was the higher purpose when the spiritual seeker left his wife? Answer, to be with another woman. Since nothing happens without a higher purpose, what was the higher purpose when the spiritual seeker left his wife? Answer, to be with another woman. Back to the profane. Not a turn on. Not a turn on. She'd never been spanked as a child. Not a turn on. She'd never been spanked as a child. You wasted your whole life, she said, flattering both herself and him. You wasted your whole life, she said, flattering both herself and him. And kind of a corollary. Two people are talking. Have I wasted my whole life? No, not yet. Have I wasted my whole life? No, not yet. I love you, she told him, and then seeing his expression, she added, laughing, but don't worry, I'm very good at unrequited love. Recently separated. In bed with her lover, she says, I do things for you I never did for my husband. Recently separated, in bed with her lover, she says, I do things for you I never did for my husband. I'd like to explain why I got into all of this, but I've done the best I can. In any case, I just as soon talk and enjoy your company and sign books if you like. So thank you very much for coming. I'll be around till the house closes here. Thank you very much for coming. The brevity of this event was because Bob Zagoni said he had a long day. Yeah. Thank you. I'll be here. Is that true? Because it looked very good. It looked very good. You are good. And now you're on video. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for being yours.
Yes. Well, she's something else.
Were you in focus?
So talented. Thank you very much. Very well. You were saying she again.
Yeah, I think I had it.
Poor thing. Poor thing. So what happened to you? I'll see you soon. Ben. Thank you for that. Shauna's excuse for that she's in the water.
I saw her all the time.
Benny, I see videos of you wrestling.